Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture series on academic research writing. This is a special topic in the general courses, such as technical writing, technical English, business communication, and purposive communication. As I promised you before, when we started this semester, one of the primary goals of our course is to teach you how to write thesis proposal, which I think it is the most important communication. So as early as now, you should start preparing for it. So today we are going to discuss how to write chapters 1 and 2, which are the introduction and the review of related literature. Now, as you see in my slide, the title of this presentation is The Architecture of Academic Writing. Why architecture? Because writing a thesis proposal is very similar to building a house. Before you start constructing anything, you need a blueprint. You need a plan. You need to know what you are going to build, why you are building it, and how you will build it. That is exactly what a thesis proposal does for your research. It is your blueprint. This is a multidisciplinary guide, which means it applies to all of you, whether you are in agriculture, criminology, engineering, business, education, or any other program. The skills you will learn today are universal. So let us get started. Before we go deeper, I want you to think about something. Right now, most of you are what we call consumers of knowledge. You read textbooks, you read articles, you absorb what other researchers have already discovered. And that is perfectly fine. That is part of learning. But here is the exciting part. As you begin writing your thesis, you are going to shift from being a consumer to being a producer of knowledge. You will not just be reading what others have solved. You will be creating, validating, and sharing evidence-based solutions to real-world problems. That is a big step, and that is what makes research so meaningful. Now, let me share a fact with you. In 2023, the Philippines produced over 15,000 index research publications in Scopus. That number has doubled over the past decade. So, Filipino researchers are contributing more and more to global knowledge, and soon you will be part of that too. But here is the key message I want you to remember. If you cannot write about your research clearly, rigorously, and persuasively, does your study actually make a difference? The answer is no. Poorly written research does not get funded. It does not get published. It does not influence policy. Writing is the medium of impact. So the quality of your writing matters just as much as the quality of your research itself. Alright, now let us look at the big picture. A complete thesis usually has 5 chapters. Let me walk you through each one quickly. Chapter 1 is the foundation. This is where you explain what you are studying and why it matters. Chapter 2 is the scaffold. This is your review of related literature, where you show what is already known about your topic and, more importantly, what remains unknown. Chapter 3 is the method. This is where you explain how you will investigate your research problem. Chapter 4 is the findings, where you present what the data reveals. And Chapter 5 is the conclusion, where you explain what it all means. Now, here is something very important that I want you to remember. Look at the note on the slide. The proposal scope only covers chapters 1, 2, and 3. These are the chapters you draft before you collect any data. Chapters 4 and 5 come later, after you have actually conducted your research and gathered your results. So for now, our focus is on learning how to build a strong foundation with chapters 1 and 2. If these chapters are weak, the entire thesis will be weak. Think of it this way. If the foundation of a house is not solid, the whole building can collapse. The same is true for your thesis. Now let us look closely at chapter 1. This chapter is called the foundation because everything else in your thesis depends on it. And chapter 1 is made up of several building blocks, like pieces of a puzzle that fit together. Let me go through each one. First is the background. This is where you introduce your topic by starting with a broad context and then narrowing it down to a specific issue. You move from the general to the specific. Second is the rationale. This explains the urgency and relevance of your study. Why is it important to study this now? What makes it timely? Third is the research gap. This is where you identify what is missing in the existing literature, what has not been studied yet, what question remains unanswered. Fourth is the statement of the problem. This is where you translate your general aim into specific research questions. This is the engine of your entire paper. Fifth is the significance of the study. Here, you explain who will benefit from your findings. Will it help policymakers, students, business owners, communities. Sixth is the scope and limitations. This is where you set the boundaries of your study and acknowledge any methodological constraints. And finally, the definition of terms. This section provides both the conceptual and operational meanings of the key terms in your study. Each of these sections plays a critical role. If you skip one or write one poorly, the entire chapter will feel incomplete. Now, let us talk about how to write the background of your study. The best way to think about it is like an inverted funnel or an inverted triangle. You start wide at the top and then you narrow down to your specific issue at the bottom. Let me give you an example. Suppose your topic is about cybercrime awareness in rural areas. At the top of the funnel, you start with the global context. You might write something like, cybercrime is a fast-growing global threat with losses exceeding $8 billion according to the FBI in 2023. That is your broad international context. Then you move to the local population level. Here you narrow it down to the Philippines. For example, in the Philippines, cybercrime complaints rose 30% from 2021 to 2023, primarily involving identity theft. And at the bottom of the funnel, you arrive at the precise issue. This is your specific focus. For example, limited empirical data exists on the awareness and prevention behaviors of victims in rural municipalities of Isabela. Do you see how it works? You go from global to national to local to your specific research problem. Now, notice the green box on the side of the slide. It says rule of evidence. This is very important. Every claim you make about existing knowledge in this funnel must be supported by a citation. You cannot just say something without evidence. Every statement needs a source. Now we are going to look at two closely related sections, the rationale and the research gap. These two work together, but they serve different purposes. The rationale answers the question, why now? It bridges the general context you establish in the background to the specific problem you want to study. It explains why your study is timely and relevant. For example, you might say, as digital infrastructure expands into rural municipalities, previously disconnected communities are now newly exposed to cyber threats. That statement shows urgency. It shows that the situation is changing, and research needs to keep up. The research gap, on the other hand, answers a different question. What is unknown? It identifies contradictions or unexplored areas in the existing literature. For example, while urban cybercrime is widely studied, rural prevention behaviors lack localized investigation. That statement shows that there is a missing piece in current knowledge, and your study aims to fill it. Now, please pay attention to the warning at the bottom of the slide. A research gap must be documented, not merely asserted. You cannot simply claim that nobody has done this research before without showing evidence from the literature. You need to prove it. You need to show that you have read the existing studies and that based on your reading, this particular area has not been explored yet. That is the difference between a strong proposal and a weak one. Alright, now we come to one of the most important parts of chapter 1, the statement of the problem. I like to call this the engine of the research paper because everything else in your thesis revolves around it. The statement of the problem has two parts. On the left, you have the general statement. This is a broad declarative sentence that states the overall aim of your study. For example, this study aims to assess cybercrime awareness in Isabela. It is clear, it is direct, and it tells the reader what the study is about. But a general statement alone is not enough. You also need specific questions. These are interrogative sentences that define the exact investigations you will carry out. And these questions must be SMART, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Let me give you some examples. Question 1. What is the level of awareness of cybercrime among residents? Question 2. What prevention behaviors are practiced? Question 3. Is there a significant relationship between awareness and behavior? When you combine the general statement with the specific questions, you get the complete statement of the problem. This section is critical because your specific questions will determine your methodology, your data collection, and your analysis. If your questions are vague, your entire study becomes unfocused, so take time to craft them carefully. Let us now discuss three more sections that complete chapter 1. First is the significance of the study. This section answers a simple but important question. Who benefits from your research? You need to identify the specific entities that will benefit from your findings. On the slide, you can see an example where the findings could benefit the local government by informing policy, the rural residents by empowering them with knowledge, and future researchers by providing baseline data for further studies. When you write this section, be specific. Do not just say society will benefit. Name the groups and explain how they will use your results. Second is the scope and limitations. This section defines the boundaries of your study. It sets the limits on geography, sample size, and time frame. It also acknowledges methodological constraints with honesty. For example, you might say, this study is limited to 3 municipalities in Isabela and will use convenience sampling. Being transparent about your limitations does not weaken your study. It actually makes it more credible because you are showing your readers that you understand the constraints of your research. Third is the definition of terms. Here, you need to provide two types of definitions. The conceptual definition is the dictionary or theoretical meaning cited from scholarly literature. The operational definition explains how the concept is specifically measured in your study. For example, if your key term is cybercrime awareness, the conceptual definition might come from a published book or journal, while the operational definition would say something like measured by the score on a 25-item questionnaire. Now, let us move on to Chapter 2, the review of related literature. I want to start by clearing up a very common misunderstanding. Many students think that Chapter 2 is just a list of summaries. They think they just need to read 10 or 15 articles and then summarize each one. That is not correct. Chapter 2 is a critical analysis. It provides context for your study, it supports your arguments, and it informs your methodology. It is not just about reporting what others have said. It is about analyzing, comparing, and connecting their ideas to your own research. Look at the image on this slide. It shows a structure like a building, with 5 pillars holding up your research. Each pillar represents a purpose of the literature review. First, it demonstrates your scholarly knowledge, meaning you have read widely on the topic. Second, it establishes context by showing where your study fits in the bigger picture. Third, it identifies the gap, which is the missing piece that justifies your study. Fourth, it provides a theoretical foundation by connecting your study to established theories. And fifth, it prevents duplication, meaning it shows that your study is original and has not been done before in the same way. So remember, Chapter 2 is not just a reading assignment. It is the evidentiary foundation that justifies the existence of Chapter 1. Now, this is a slide I really want you to pay attention to, because this is where many students struggle. There is a big difference between a summary and a synthesis, and your literature review must use synthesis, not just summary. On the left side, you see the summary approach, which is labeled as weak. In a summary, you go source by source. You write something like, Garcia, 2020, found this, Santos, 2021, studied that, Reyes, 2022, examined this. Each source is presented separately, like a list. The problem with this approach is that it fails to show critical thinking or relationships between the sources. It does not tell the reader how these studies connect to each other or to your research. On the right side, you see the synthesis approach, which is labeled as strong. In a synthesis, you group your sources by theme, you note contradictions, you connect everything to the research gap. For example, you might write, multiple studies confirm that cybercrime awareness is low in urban areas, as shown by Garcia 2020 and Santos 2021. However, Reyes 2022 argues that rural areas may have different patterns. Do you see the difference? In synthesis, you are not just listing what each author said, you are grouping ideas, comparing findings, and showing where disagreements or gaps exist. This is the kind of critical thinking that your thesis panel and your advisor will be looking for. So please practice synthesis, not just summary. Now that you understand the difference between summary and synthesis, the next question is, how do you organize your literary review? There are 3 common approaches, and the right one depends on the nature of your research. The first approach is thematic. This is the most common one and the default for undergraduate proposals. In a thematic organization, you group your sources by concepts or variables. For example, if your study has 3 variables, you would have 3 main sections in your literature review, one for each variable. The second approach is chronological. Here you arrange your sources by publication order to show how ideas or knowledge have evolved over time. This is best used when you are tracing the historical development of a policy, a technology, or a concept. The third approach is methodological. In this style, you group your sources by the research methods they used, such as qualitative versus quantitative. This works best when your study is evaluating different approaches to the same phenomenon. Also, take note of the target metrics at the bottom of the slide. For a strong undergraduate literature review, you should aim for 15 to 20 scholarly sources, and at least 70% of those sources should be published within the last 10 years. This ensures that your review reflects current knowledge, not outdated information. Alright, this is another important part of Chapter 2 that students sometimes find confusing: the theoretical framework and the conceptual framework. Let me explain the difference. The theoretical framework is grounded in established, globally validated theories. These are theories that have been tested and accepted by the academic community. For example, the theory of planned behavior by Adjen is a widely used theory in behavioral research. When you use a theoretical framework, you are borrowing an existing lens to look at your research problem. The conceptual framework, on the other hand, is something that you, as the researcher, construct yourself. It illustrates the specific relationships between variables in your study. It is your own map of how the independent variables connect to the dependent variable. Look at the diagram on the slide. You can see the independent variables on the left, represented by smaller circles, and they all point to the dependent variable, the larger circle on the right. This visual representation helps your reader understand how your study is structured and what relationships you are trying to investigate. Now, here is the key takeaway. The framework is not just a decoration you put in your thesis to make it look academic. It actually guides your research questions, your methodology, and your interpretation of results. A well-constructed framework keeps your entire study aligned and focused. Without it, your research can easily lose direction. Now let us look at how Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 work together. This is a concept many students miss, so please listen carefully. Look at the diagram on this slide. In the center, you have the research gap. This is the core of your proposal. On the left side, Chapter 2, the literature review, provides the evidence that the gap exists. By reading and synthesizing existing studies, you demonstrate that a particular area has not been explored yet. On the right side, Chapter 1, specifically the statement of the problem, formulates specific questions that target that gap. So you see, these two chapters are deeply connected. Chapter 2 is not just a separate reading assignment that you do independently from Chapter 1. It is the evidentiary foundation that justifies the existence of your introduction. Without a strong literature review, your claim that a research gap exists has no proof. And without a clear statement of the problem, your literature review has no direction. Think of it as a cycle. Your reading informs your problem, and your problem guides your reading. They feed into each other. That is why you should work on both chapters at the same time, going back and forth between them, rather than finishing one completely before starting the other. And finally, let us talk about something very relevant today: the role of AI tools in your research process. I know many of you are already using AI tools like ChatGPT and other similar platforms, and that is fine. AI can be a helpful partner in your research. It can generate keyword lists, explain statistical concepts, but here is where you need to be very careful. AI is a partner, not a ghostwriter. It cannot evaluate whether a theory genuinely applies to your specific local context. That is your job as the researcher. AI does not know the realities of your community, your barangay, or your municipality the way you do. Now, let us look at the flowchart on this slide. It shows you what to do when an AI tool generates a citation. The first question you should ask is, can you find the original article in a scholarly database, such as Google Scholar or EBSCO? If the answer is yes, then you access the article and read it yourself. You verify the claims manually before applying them to your synthesis. That is the responsible way to use AI-generated references. But if the answer is no, if you cannot find the original article anywhere, then you must discard that citation immediately. A fabricated citation is not just a mistake, it constitutes academic dishonesty, and the consequences can be severe. So use AI wisely. Let it assist you, but never let it replace your own critical thinking. At the end of the day, The research is yours and the responsibility is yours too. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. Thank you for listening, and I hope this presentation has given you a clearer understanding of how to build a strong thesis proposal. Good luck with your research, everyone.